Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the sixth round from the FIDE Canada's chess tournament, which is being held here in Toronto, Canada. Now, yesterday, I had a very important victory with a black piece against Alireza Firouzja from France that took me back to an even score, and today I try to keep the momentum going, but unfortunately, I have my second black game in a row playing as the very talented 17-year-old Indian junior, Domaraju Gukesh. Now, Gukesh is tied for first place going into this game alongside Jan Nepomniachtchi, and with the white pieces, I'm expecting him to try and come out fighting. All right, let's jump right into the action. So the game here starts with the move e4. Now, in this position, I decide to play the move c5, knight f3, and I go g6. Now, this, of course, is the hyper-accelerated dragon. For anybody who's a big fan of astronomy and constellations, the reason that we call the structure the dragon, let's just say white takes and you get some position like this, for example, is that these pawns combined with the knight on f6 they basically form what is known as the constellation Draco, which of course means dragon. So that's why we call this structure the dragon. But when I go g6, this is what we call the hyper accelerated dragon, where I'm trying to fianchetto my bishop to g7 as fast as possible. Now, I have done this before. I actually played this in the Grand Swiss tournament held in the Isle of Man in October of last year against Andrei Yesipenko from Russia, who actually is here helping one of the female players. So, after g6, the game continues with c3. Now, Gukesh decides to play the classic Alapin or c3 Sicilian by pushing the pawn. It's a little bit of a safer approach rather than going right into the hyper-accelerated dragon. So he goes c3. I play d5, we get e5, and now I play the move bishop g4. In my game in the Isle of Man against Andrei Yesipenko, I did play this move knight to c6 alongside a6. Now, the big difference, of course, is that after knight c6, white can play h3, stopping you from developing the bishop to the square. So today I play bishop g4. Gukesh goes bishop b5 check, knight c6. He trades the bishop for the knight, and now I have the double pawns, one on top of each other. Now, in this position, the game continues with the move castles, and here I play this move c4. Now, this, of course, was some preparation I did prior to the tournament during my training camp, and so I felt very comfortable with this move. Now, this position I think has been played maybe once or twice, but it's extremely rare. Normally, black has played alternatives to the c4 move. So I played c4 here, and now Gukesh plays the move d3. Now, this move is a very solid move. There are many different possibilities for white to play here. I won't go through them because obviously I might have this position in a game later on in the tournament. So Gukesh plays d3, but already here I'm feeling very good because I'm up 20 minutes on the clock, and I'm still in preparation. So I take the pawn on d3, he takes back, I play bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, and now I go bishop g7. Now, the reason I trade my bishop for the knight right away is if I were to play bishop g7 immediately, white can go knight b to d2, over protecting this knight on f3. Now, effectively what happens here is, let's say I play e6, h3 is played. Most likely I have to trade the bishop for the knight, so I move the bishop away. After queen e2, there are threats like g4 here to try and trap the bishop on f5. So if I take on f3 and white gets a knight here, now the knight guards the pawn, white can move the knight to d4, and this knight is just perfectly placed in the position. So when I decide to take the knight on f3, after queen takes and bishop g7, white's knight does not simply get to this f3 square. You're going to have to go 1, 2, 3 to get the knight there, which means you will lose some time. So Gukesh plays queen e2, I play queen c7, and now he plays rook e1. Now, at this point, I was finally out of my preparation, but I had built up a little bit of an advantage on the clock. Now, it's worth pointing out here that e6 is another move that I thought about playing, but at the end of the day, the reason I play queen c7 is that if white goes f4 here to protect the pawn, now I can play f6 here, and after takes and knight f6, I think black is completely fine. Now, you might be thinking, okay, who cares? What's the big deal? But there is a very important point here, which is that when white plays rook e1 here, if I go f6 now, white can trade and develop this bishop to the f4 square, attacking the queen on c7. If I take the free bishop, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time. Queen takes e7 is simply checkmate. So after bishop f4, queen d7, and knight d2, now this dark square bishop for white is going to go to the e5 square. You can move the knight to f3 and d4, or b3 and c5 slash d4, and this bishop is incredible. So that's why in this position, I played queen c7, because if f4 is played, now the bishop does not get out to this f4 square, and that is very critical. That's why Gukesh did play rook e1, and now I decided to play the move e6, trying to put this knight on e7 and castle the king out of the center. Gukesh plays b4 here, and this is a move that I think was actually slightly inaccurate from a human perspective. I thought knight d2, knight e7, and knight b3 made a little bit more sense to try and put this knight on c5. Now, it's worth pointing out that if I can get a position with, say, c5 and castles here, black is probably a little bit better here because you have more central control. You can push f6 or go knight c6 to pressure the pawn on e5 as well, with the queen, the bishop, and the knight. So white definitely wants to stop black from getting these pawns to d5 and c5, which is why Gukesh plays b4. Now, I thought knight d2, knight e7, and knight b3 was a little bit better, because now if I try to go c5, there's queen b5, checking the king, and after I block, takes, and knight d3, white simply has one extra pawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So white has an extra pawn and should win the game. So I actually thought knight d2, knight b3 was a little bit better here, because if I were to castle, for example, in this position, and white gets knight c5, down the road, after a5 and b4, white can create a bastion here with the knight protected on c5, and I can't get this knight to c6 to pressure the pawn because I can't push this pawn forward. So I thought this would have been a little bit better, but Gukesh plays b4. Now I go knight e7, he plays knight d2, and I come up with a really, really great move over the board, which is a strange move, knight to c8. Now, I thought this was a great move for the following reason. I can't go c5 here because there's queen b5 check once again, picking up the pawn on c5. If I can't go c5 here, let's say I castle and white gets knight b3, the knight, once again, is jumping either to c5 or d4, and my position is very, very cramped here, and I have a very, very bad knight on e7. If I could get this knight to c6 here to pressure the pawn, I'd be doing very well. But again, I can't push this pawn, which means where is my knight going? If I go knight f5, white can always try to kick the knight with g4, for example, and I could maybe go knight c8 again here, but it's a little bit late. So I play knight c8 right away, and the idea is simple. I want to bring this knight to a better square. And that means I want to go to b6 and then either to c4 or back to d7. So let's say white plays h3, knight b6. If white goes knight b3, now I have knight c4, pressuring this pawn on e5, and more importantly, I have a nice bastion as well because this pawn is on b4. Now, that's why I thought b4 was a slight mistake, because if I ever get the knight here and this knight goes away, now this pawn would love to go back to b3, but you've already pushed it forward to b4, so it can't go backwards. So I was very, very happy when I played knight c8 because I realized that even if I can't get the knight to c4, white can't move his knight away because he yields the square, which means he can't take advantage of the c5 square without giving up the c4 square in return. And additionally, let's say white goes knight f3, for example. Even if I don't have knight c4, I also have knight d7 here, pressuring the pawn on e5, and down the road, I can also go c5 here, and I think that black should be completely fine. So when I played knight c8, in this position, Gukesh, I could tell, was very surprised by this move, but then he started to think, and I actually spoke to him a little bit after the game, and he thought this was a very good move as well. So I played knight c8, and now he plays the move c4 here, trying to get rid of a weakness, but also take away the bastion idea with knight b6 and knight c4. Now I castle, and he goes bishop b2, and here I play his move a5. Now this is a move that I played after a long think here. I actually wasn't sure if it was the best move. I spent 20 minutes to play it because I simply didn't see a better plan. Now, after a5 here, Gukesh played the move a3, and this basically forced the game down a path where it's leading towards a draw very, very quickly. Gukesh could have tried to take on d5 here, and I actually intended to take with the c-pawn. E-takes is also possible as well, but both of us were unsure what was happening in the game after b5, a4, rook c1, and queen b7. Now, after bishop to d4, black can play knight to b6 here, and it's really unclear. Is this pawn very strong, or is it very weak? If I don't play a4, say I go knight b6 right away, after rook c1, queen b7, and a4, now white has a protected pass pawn. He can go knight b3 to hit the pawn, and I think white is significantly better. But when I go a4, it takes away the square from the knight. It also takes away the pawn push to a4, and I just didn't know what was going on. Now, the computer, I think, gives white a bit of an advantage here after queen to e3, but I felt that the chance would be the position would be very, very tricky, and both sides would get chances. Both sides would have chances to play for a win. Which is why I thought a3 was a very, very practical move from Gukesh, because you have to keep in mind, Gukesh is leading the tournament here. He's on a +2 score. He's won 2 games, no losses. The last thing he wants to do is lose a game with white here and then really ruin his tournament. So I thought a3 was a very logical move, because now there's not going to ever be a major imbalance in the position. So here I trade everything off. I take on c4. he takes, and I play his move knight b6. Now, I could have played a move like rook to d8, but in this position, I have a slight weakness with the pawn on c6 versus the pawn on b4. And I realized one more point that I should make is when I played a5, this option to take here on c4 with knight b6 does exist. But after knight to a5, knight d5, and a3, here white's pawn on b4 is protected, and white will simply go rook c1 next move and pressure the pawn on c6 because he has both of these pawns connected. So in the game when I play knight b6 here, there's no pawn on a2 to push to a3, and we simply have one pawn versus one pawn. So it's PvP in this situation, and white can't really keep this pawn on b4 without trading off a lot of pieces. For example, if white goes knight a5, now I have knight to d5. There's no pawn to a3 to support the pawn because the pawns have been traded off the board. So because of that, after white plays, say, queen e4, there's simply rook to b8 here. And now I'm pressuring the pawn on b4 with both my knight and my rook. And black, if anything, is better here because there are two weaknesses on e5 as well as b4. So Gukesh trades the knights off, and now he goes bishop c3. I play queen to b5. We get queen e4, and I go rook d8. Now, black is still probably very marginally better in this position because, again, white's pawns can be targeted on b4 and e5 by the dark square b, whereas white's bishop can't touch any of my pawns. All 5 of my pawns here are on the opposite color relative to the dark square bishop that white possesses. So I go bishop f8, he plays king g2, and now I play queen b7. We get rook c1, I go rook d5, and now he plays bishop to e1. Now, black is very slightly better, but objectively, there simply isn't enough to try and win. If I could win one of these pawns, maybe I've got a chance, but it's just going to be very difficult. Now, here I played this move h5. This is a move that I actually really wish I had not played here. I think I should have gone bishop e7 and just left these pawns at home on h7 and h2. I go h5, Gukesh plays bishop c3, bishop e7, and now he goes h4, and here I play the move bishop f8. Now, I could have played the move queen d7, creating a double stack, and try to take advantage of the file, but once again, I think white simply will just start waiting with bishop b2 and bishop c3, and there's simply nothing to do. I can't really push pawns on the king side. The pawn structure is very fixed, and I can't really ever go rook b5, excuse me, because after queen c6 takes, game simply will end in a draw as well. So even though I am slightly better with my bishop spying the pawn on b4, but with the pawns being fixed on the king side, there's simply not a whole lot I can do. So I go bishop f8, we get rook a1, bishop e7, rook c1, and now I decide to play the move rook b5 here rather than forcing a threefold with bishop e7. And this is simply because I was hoping to keep the game going. Maybe Gukesh would spend 5-6 minutes somewhere, get into time pressure without any increment. Maybe something could happen. Objectively, I knew the game was still a draw, but I simply was not ready to call it a day yet. So I play rook b5. Now he goes rook c1 back, and I play the move rook b6. Of course, I could trade the bishops here, but once again, this endgame with rook and 4 pawns versus rook and 4 pawns is simply a dead draw. So here I go rook b6, he plays bishop d2, and now I play this move rook a6. Now, this was a horrible, horrible move to play, all things considered, because it gave Gukesh a huge opportunity to go for something very tricky here. Now, Gukesh played the move rook c4 after a bit of a think, but he could have played this move b5 here, sacking a pawn. Because if I take with a pawn, I do a Botez gambit, and I promptly resign. And after queen takes rook b1, the queen guards the rook here, and now it gets very, very tricky. Because if I go queen d5, white can trade. If I take with a c-pawn, I actually am losing here after rook b8, king g7, and let's move bishop to g5 here, because white is getting this bishop to the f6 square. After rook a8, check, king g8. Maybe this is still a draw, where I can simply dilly-dally here. But I actually feel like in this position, I'm simply stuck. I can't move the king because I'm pinned. If I ever move the rook, there's bishop e7, winning the bishop. And it feels like after f3 and g4 here, actually, wait, the eval bar is starting to change a little bit. White might be winning here. It's starting to go up a little bit. If g5 takes, the eval bar, as you guys can see, is actually creeping up. So the computer does not realize, or at least the weak engine, that this is so bad. But I did see that this was very, very dangerous during the game. And so when Gukesh didn't go for this and he played rook c4, I immediately wanted to force the draw. Probably the best that I do have here, by the way, after rook b1 is to play the very crazy move pawn to f5 here, sacking a pawn. If we were playing chess 600 years ago, black would probably be a little bit better here. But in modern day chess, white can go for the end peasant trick with pawn takes pawn. After takes, and rook b7, probably after c5, the game is still a draw, but it's very, very complicated here, and maybe both sides have some chances. At any rate, Gukesh plays rook c4, and now I play rook b6. So it's like, okay, time to make the draw. You've overlooked b5. No time for nonsense. So after bishop e3, I take the pawn. He trades the queens on c6, and now I go rook to b8. Very important move as I stop white from going rook c8, and now the game ends in a draw after bishop c5. If white were to play bishop g5, by the way, to show you one sample line, I can simply go for a yo-yo, moving the bishop back and forth because my rook covers his back rank, so the rook never gets in. So Gukesh goes bishop c5, we trade the bishops on c5, and now the game ends in a draw after I play the move king g7. Both sides have played 40 moves. We're allowed to offer a draw, so I offer Gukesh a draw here, of course, with rook and 4 pawns for each side. Neither of us have any chance of trying to win the game, and it ends peacefully. So this game ends in a draw. I'm pretty happy with the result. It felt like a very interesting game. I was very happy that I found this knight c8 concept early. But to his credit, I felt like Gukesh was very smart. He never really let the game become very crazy and hectic. That might have something to do with the fact that I beat him the last time we played in Norway chess. But it was very smart of him because as a tournament leader, he managed the risk. He got surprised in the opening, but he never let it really get too out of control. I thought after I played knight c8, we were going to have a very interesting game where I might have a chance to win. But it simply was not meant to be. And both of us, I think, played pretty good moves overall. And it was a very peaceful game. So, 6th-round game ends in a draw. This means that I remain on my even score. None of the leaders were able to win their game. Nepo drew against Fabiano, and in the other game, I believe, well, Gukesh, the other leader, drew against me, obviously. However, Praggnanandhaa did win his game against Abasov to move to half a point more than I have. Vidit also beat Alireza Firouzja, so he's on the same score that I have. So for Alireza Firouzja and Nijat Abasov, it's pretty much been a tournament to forget so far, but we still have a long way to go, and there's still everything to be played for. Or we're playing, everything is still in play, I should say. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. If you are not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below. And we'll be back tomorrow after my 7th round game against Jan Nepomniachtchi, the winner of the previous 2 Canada's chess tournaments. I have the white pieces. Let's see how it goes. I will, of course, recap that game. So I'll see you tomorrow. Until then, have a great rest of your day. Keep it real, everybody. Bye.